Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. This is the first of Erwin Mitchell's webinar series about inquests and the coroner's process. At Erwin Mitchell, we are a full-service law firm and we offer a range of services to our clients to support them through the inquest process. For example, we can support them with preliminary advice before the inquest, helping them in advance or through to representation on the day itself. There are also occasions where we support families following the inquest, and that might be, for example, a potential claim for compensation through either a clinical negligence case, serious injuries such as road traffic accident, a Human Rights Act claim, asbestos-related diseases claims, or deaths abroad as well. Now, today we're going to hear from 4 amazing speakers, and we have firstly Oliver Carter, a colleague in the he's an associate solicitor in our public law and human rights team, and he will be doing a talk with Steve Clark, our welfare benefits advisor, and they will be discussing the different funding options available for clients through the inquest process itself. We will hear from our lovely client Leila Smith about her personal experience of going through an inquest after sadly losing her son Darnell. And then we will also hear from our colleague Michaela Morris, who is our client services manager and supports families through the inquest and signposting to charities for support during such difficult times. Now, if I may do so, I'll now hand over to Oliver Carter to start the talk. Thank you, Oliver.
Thank you very much, Sinead, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. I know we've got quite a range of attendees from our list at this seminar. So although I'm going to be speaking about funding for inquests, I thought before doing that, I'd just briefly set the scene for those people who might not work professionally in inquests or might not have experienced them in some way, just to say what an inquest is. You may know, many of you may know this, of course, but an inquest is an investigation by a coroner into a death. And coroners have a duty under Section 1 of the Coroners and Justice Act 2009 to investigate a death if there is reason to suspect that the deceased person died of violent or unnatural death, or if their cause of death was unknown, or if they died while in custody or state detention. So those are, broadly speaking, the circumstances in which a coroner has a duty to investigate a death. And the purpose of an inquest is to answer 4 questions, which are: first, who the deceased was; second, when they died; third, where they died; and fourth, how they died. Usually, of course, the question of how they died is the most important and most difficult to answer. Inquests are inquisitorial processes. They're not adversarial. So it is an investigation led by a coroner, and people involved in inquests who have an interest in a particular inquest, including the family of the deceased person, are interested persons. They're not parties as they might be in civil litigation, because, as I said, it's an inquisitorial process, not an adversarial process. So that's my initial very brief introduction to inquests. It is a complex and always developing area of law, and we could spend hours talking about that. Just to briefly introduce myself, as Sinead said, I'm a solicitor in the public law and human rights team here at Erwin Mitchell. I provide advice to bereaved families throughout the inquest process, and most often in my role, that's following a death in prison or police custody, or following the use of force by police, or deaths of people who are receiving mental health treatment at the time of their death, either as patients detained under the Mental Health Act in hospital or in the community. So that's where I come to this and my experience of inquests. So as I've said on this first slide, for bereaved families who do seek legal advice or representation at an inquest, there are several possible ways of funding that work, including legal aid, which is public funding, and that is still available for certain types of inquest; conditional fee agreements, or CFAs, which are also commonly referred to as no-win, no-fee agreements; private funding or crowdfunding. Crowdfunding, as you may know, is essentially raising money online through platforms such as Crowd Justice, GoFundMe, and pro bono, which is the Latin term for legal services which are provided without charge. I'll talk in more detail about the first two of those types of funding, legal aid and conditional fee agreements, because hopefully for private funding and pro bono, that's fairly self-explanatory what they are. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. I'll talk about legal aid first of all. Thank you. So in legal aid for inquests, there are two different types of legal aid which may be available for bereaved families. The first of those is called legal help. And as it says on the slide, legal help funds legal advice and assistance when preparing for an inquest. In summary, it's for the work carried out by lawyers outside courts in preparation for an inquest. The second type of funding, called exceptional case funding, or ECF, funds legal representation at an inquest. So attending inquest hearings, pre-inquest review hearings, if they happen, and providing that representation in court, and that may be through a solicitor and a barrister. The eligibility criteria for legal aid are very complex, and whether legal aid is available for an inquest will depend on the circumstances of the person's death. So this brief presentation really is intended just to be an overview of when legal aid may be available. And as I've said at the bottom of this slide, non-means tested legal aid may be available where there is an arguable breach of the deceased person's right to life as protected under Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights. And I'll turn to discuss that a little bit more on the next slide, if we can move on there. Thank you. So as I've said, legal help is the first form of legal aid relevant to inquests. It's available subject to the normal financial means test for civil legal aid, which is complex, as all things legal aid are, is available online. I won't go into detail about that, but essentially the financial means test for civil legal aid requires a person to have very limited income, either through employment or benefits, and very limited savings or capital in order to be financially eligible for legal aid. It's quite a small percentage of the population who are now eligible for legal aid. Non-means tested legal help is, however, available if an application for exceptional case funding would be likely to succeed. And when I say non-means tested, I mean the legal aid agency, the government body that awards legal aid, won't scrutinise the bereaved family's finances in circumstances where that type of funding is available. So as you'll see, whether non-means tested legal help is available is to some extent contingent on whether exceptional case funding would be available. Moving on to exceptional case funding then, that is a non-means tested form of legal aid, and it's available where there is an obligation to grant funding under Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which, as I said, is the right to life. And for example, that arises where a person dies a violent or non-natural death in prison or police custody, or if they are their death results directly from use of force by police, or if at the time of their death they're detained under the Mental Health Act in a psychiatric hospital. At the very bottom of this slide, I've linked to the Lord Chancellor's guidance on exceptional case funding for inquests, which is guidance provided by the government, essentially summarising the criteria for awarding exceptional case funding. So you may wish to look at that if you'd like more detail on this. But essentially, we as lawyers in circumstances where a family may be entitled to exceptional case funding would prepare an application to the legal aid agency explaining why that is based on the circumstances of the person's death. So that's that first number one there is if it falls in one of those categories of death where there's an obligation on the government to grant funding. Secondly, exceptional case funding can be granted where there is a wider public interest in the bereaved family being represented at the inquest, which is likely to produce significant benefits for a class of persons other than the bereaved family. That is quite rare in my experience, that we're able to persuade the legal aid agency that there is a wider public interest, but it's an argument that can be made, again, by lawyers on behalf of a bereaved family to seek legal aid funding for representation at the inquest. And if a person comes to a coroner's officer or a solicitor or any professional, then a solicitor practicing in this area can give advice on whether an application for exceptional case funding may be possible. If we can move on to the next slide, I'll talk briefly about conditional fee agreements, which, as I said, are sometimes referred to as no win, no fee agreements, and they may be used to fund legal advice and representation for an inquest, because under a CFA, lawyers acting for a bereaved family will seek to recover the costs of their work from the opponent if there is a successful civil claim after the inquest. As I've said here, the opponent may be a public body such as an NHS trust, a police force, or a government department, such as, for example, the Ministry of Justice, which oversees prisons, or a private organisation such as the deceased person's employer. Again, if a family wishes to speak to a solicitor about whether a conditional fee agreement may be available, then solicitors Irwin Mitchell and no doubt elsewhere will be happy to have a free of charge discussion about whether a CFA might be a possibility to fund both work on an inquest for a family and then advice on a civil claim separately but related to that. As I've said at the end of this slide, a legal expenses insurance policy may be taken out to protect the claimant or claimants, who may be members of the bereaved family, from having to pay the opponent's costs if the case is ultimately unsuccessful. This is very high level, of course, and individual advice will have to be given in any particular case. But if we move on now to the next slide. Yeah, this final slide is just some advice and resources for bereaved families. Other speakers are going to touch on this in a bit more detail, but some of the organisations I've linked to here provide support and advice to families. So Inquest is a charity with expertise on state-related deaths. They produce a very detailed handbook for bereaved families, which is available via their website. The United Friends and Families campaign is a coalition of families and people who've been affected by deaths in police, prison and psychiatric detention. And then there are other organisations such as Action Against Medical Accidents, Survivors of Bereavement by Suicide, and many other charities and non-profit organisations working to support families. And there's also a Ministry of Justice guide to coroner services for bereaved people, which is a shorter guide than the Inquest one that I've mentioned at the top. Again, available online and provides an overview of the inquest process.
But yes, we've got Leela here today, our client. We're so grateful that you've been to attend with us and share your story, because it is a personal story about Darnell, Leela's son, and then her experience through the inquest process. Now, Leela's asked me on the next slide will be some photos of Darnell, and what we wanted to just say was a little bit about who Darnell was as a person, and Leela's asked me just to go through that, just because obviously the difficulty, and I appreciate it won't be easy today, nor was it easy when you had to do the same during the inquest process. But Darnell had complex medical history. He had cerebral palsy, scoliosis, epilepsy, and sickle cell disease. And it was his sickle cell disease that he suffered a complication with and sadly had to go into hospital for treatment. And it was during his time in hospital that he sadly passed away in November 2022. Now, one thing I did want to mention is you can see on the slides here how smiley Darnell was. I'm sure Leela won't mind me sharing how actually cheeky he was from what you said. How it, he had such an infectious laugh. The videos that you shared with us were truly amazing. And there was one story, which again, I hope you don't mind me sharing, where everyone in Darnell's GP surgery knew him very well when he came in for his annual health review. They knew Darnell, they knew how cheeky he was, and they all really loved seeing him. He had quite a hand at trying to steal handbags at one point, pulling people's hair because he found that so funny. He was such a lovely young man. But even just seeing on the slides there, you can see how happy he was with his dad Errol there, That was just after he'd had COVID, wasn't it? So yeah, it was the first time he'd been able to go out and enjoy the sunshine as well.
That was, it was 21. Was it 20? No, that was 22.
Yeah.
His 20,
In the summer.
his 22nd birthday. That was on his birthday. So yeah.
Yeah. And it was a special time because, like you say, he'd been cooped up inside, hadn't he? Because one thing to mention as well, Leila was Darnell's main carer and his advocate. You know, you and Errol were Darnell's advocate, but it's fair to say that obviously as a mum, you provided a lot of personal care, a lot of support for Darnell from him being baby. And that continues, that advocacy for Darnell, what he went through, still continues to this day. So you'll see on the next slide, will be a bit of information about the inquest itself and Leila's view. So on the slide, I'm not going to repeat it, but it goes through when the inquest took place, the fact that it was meant to be for one day, but actually it carried on for 2 days, just for some complications with hearings being remote and needing more time, and rightly so. Inquests are certainly important investigations that need as much time as possible. And Leila instructed us after actually approaching other law firms who couldn't assist. And it's important to raise there that just as we hope that these webinars will shed some light on the inquest process, but actually before getting to that part where families don't have legal representation, a kind of battle that they've got to find out where to go, where's the information, and where do we get support when going through an inquest alone, which many families do. So it was important just to mention that on the slides there as well. But Leila's here today to give her personal view about the inquest process. And if you're able to, Leila, could you just describe to us how you found the coroner's process?
First, it was very daunting because we didn't know what to expect. We'd had very little information from the officers at the coroners. One of the main things I asked was, did we need a solicitor? And I was told that they couldn't really answer that question. That was entirely up to us. Which was like another kick in the face, really, because what do you do when it's something that you've never done before? That was probably when I started looking for.
You did a lot of research.
Yeah, I did a lot of research beforehand.
Yeah, which I was surprised at because it was kind of a call, wasn't it? And
yeah.
You told me yourself actually she'd done so much research trying to find out who to contact, what to do.
Yeah. The other solicitors that I called said no, they won't do anything until after the coroners. Another solicitor quoted us £6,000 and then more on top of per page of paperwork.
Right, okay.
But the actual coroner's inquest, I didn't know what to expect, to be honest. I had no clue what to expect. Obviously, you took us through everything beforehand. Yeah. I wanted to see the room.
Yeah, well, and rightly so. It's things like that you want to see where the hearing's going to be, what to expect, any of the formalities. Because I know afterwards you hadn't realised, it is a formal courtroom, but stand up when the coroner comes in. And,
I didn't realise that at all.
I suppose things like that, where if you haven't got representation, you will not.
The legal talk, I had no understanding of anything that was really going on, other than at the end when it was the verdict, I understood the tests and things like that. But someone who doesn't have a knowledge of university may not understand that part of it. Understanding how conclusions are made, the verdict.
I think one thing I remember you saying was about going through that process and having to do all that research on your own. Actually, what if you're someone who hasn't got access to the internet? What if you are doing this alone? And I suppose from your point of view, would there be one thing in your mind where you'd say, actually, if this was different at the beginning, it would have helped?
Yeah, maybe a pack given by the coroner's officers to families so they can understand the different processes, information on where to go, information on how whether you need a solicitor or not is one of the main things, because when you're going into that setting, you do need a solicitor without a doubt. I did not understand anything or in legal terms of what I could have asked if Sinead hadn't been there. I would have blamed. I would have gone in there on a blame.
Yeah, you just
I would have said, you've done, knowing, and not with the unknown of not being able to do that in a coroner's court, because you assume that it's a court, it's like a court of law, even though it is the law.
Yeah, but like
Yeah.
as Oliver said,
It's not a blame, it's about facts, yeah.
It's difficult because, like you say, you don't know. You've not been through that before.
No.
But yeah, it's certainly when we first started this process, we thought it would be a one day inquest, and then that obviously changed. Didn't it? That got extended because of the evidence on the day, and yeah, it's one thing I certainly remember is your family were there throughout to support you and Errol, which was fantastic and highly. When you've got that family support, it does make a difference, doesn't it?
I suppose if you go in there on your own, that a bit awful. The coroner was really supportive. She was absolutely lovely.
She took the time as well, didn't she, to go through things. Yeah, that is the coroner's role. They do go through that and make sure the family understand the process. But it's a lot on the day. Yeah. But it's I suppose, was there anything else that you wanted to share about your experience before we discuss about Sickle Cell Society, charity?
It's not an experience I'd want to go through again. I know that. But if I did have to go through it again, I'd know what to expect. I'd know exactly what to expect, and obviously the route to go down.
Well, just grateful for you being here to share that, because it's a hard process for families to have to go through. And you also gave evidence on the day as well. You prepared a statement, you got up, you gave your evidence, and even that is very daunting. And you've done that, and you're still advocating now for Darnell. You're working with the trust, you're working with the Sickle Cell Society, the national charity, to make changes, because sadly in Darnell's circumstances, the coroner's conclusion did find that there were gross failings of care, the nursing care that he sadly didn't receive whilst in hospital. And it's following that inquest, as I say, that you are now working with the trust and to make sure that things do change going forward. And not many families can go down that route, and you're able to say, well, actually, I'm still going to do this for everybody else. That means a lot.
Yeah, the prevention of future death.
So once
the coroner's verdict was a narrative verdict. There was a prevention of future deaths put on the board regarding Darnell, the way that he had the lack of basic care.
And also his it was this individualised care plan. The electronic system on the database, you couldn't easily find his individualised care plan for sickle cell disease, and that was a key point actually. And disability awareness, absolutely. That was a real issue because the nurses couldn't find it. They didn't know where to find it on the electronic system, and it was a specialist ward, and that was really concerning when you're going to hospital in that particular circumstance, for example, thinking that they are specialists, they know what they're doing, but actually the care plan, which was needed to dictate his care, they couldn't even access that. So the coroner, she was very thorough, and she said straight away, didn't she, that this needs to be, preventing future death support needs to be issued, so that changes can be made to the electronic system going forward, and they have responded to that, which is promising, isn't it? Yeah. I just wanted to go on to the next slide about the Sickle Cell Society. because that is a national charity, which Leela and Errol are both working quite closely with in Darnell's memory. And we wanted to use this platform to help raise awareness of the charity, to show support. There's a link there on the slide as well. I don't know if Leela, you want to say anything about the charity itself?
So it's the main charity in England that support people with sickle cell and carers. And to be fair, they also help after someone's died. They've supported me and Errol amazingly. They've helped us write letters to the CEO of the hospital. I can't even think right now what else they've helped with.
That would be nice at any
Yeah, but they've really helped. Yeah. On Saturday we did an awareness day in Sheffield, in memory of Darnell. I think we raised over £2,000, but we haven't even counted the money yet. And the CEO of the Sickle Cell Society came up and did a talk. I did a PowerPoint talk. But sickle cell's not spoke about enough in England, when it affects thousands of people every day, thousands of parents, thousands of families. And it's just about supporting them, because I was one of those people and I don't feel like I got enough support as a carer. So yeah, it's for that.
And we would highly ask people to click on that link to look at the charity and see how you can support them if you're able to going forward. And I know Michaela, who is our next speaker, will be discussing in a bit more detail other charities as well, but we wanted to use this platform to raise awareness of sickle cell disease. Yeah, we'll hand over to Michaela now. Okay.
Welcome, and thank you, Leela and Sinead. That was really powerful. As I say, my name is Michaela. I'm an occupational therapist and client support manager at Irwin Mitchell. I work with our team supporting people with asbestos and occupational disease. So obviously that would include mesothelioma, as mentioned by Steve, asbestos-related cancer, but also other conditions that people have contracted through work. I cover the north of England and have a background of palliative care and mental health. And we support our clients in a wide range of things, whether it be accessing support for carers, signposting for charities, equipment provision, discharge planning, working out what they're going to do with their cat after they die, supporting them for the inquest and coronial process, a huge range of things. And very lucky to work with my colleague Jacqueline Bates, who covers the south of England, and Jacqueline is a very experienced social worker. So we're a double act. Also, we're part of the wider support and rehabilitation service at Irwin Mitchell, and they would support families in situations where there's been a fatality, such as a suicide, unexpected death in hospital, and a preventable death in hospital, or fatalities from road traffic accidents. Again, supporting families in whatever is needed. Next slide, please, Donna. So those are the sorts of areas that we cover, but that's probably not the most important thing that we need to focus on today. So move on to the next slide, please. So just setting the scene, as Oliver mentioned, the coronial process is a very formal one, and as Leela said, it's a very daunting one. The language, the expectation, the formality, the courtroom, and I think it's important to remind ourselves of the type of deaths that will be referred to the coroner, and obviously many of these, not all, will also go to inquest. And I think when we look at that list, I hope you're all able to see that okay, just thinking about the level of distress caused by any of those deaths. And with that, the impact, the long-term impact on the family, but also very often on the health professionals and social care professionals, police, ambulance, whoever has been involved. They're not straightforward deaths. That's exactly why they're being referred to the coroners. And I think recognizing that it is a process of investigation, and with that there can be huge expectations that this is going to provide all the answers and that this will be closure. And I think from what Leela said, and many people have said to me, it is far from it. So we can go to the next slide, please. So obviously, for many families, there's time before death, if it's illness related, or people have had a difficult period in a hospital or been struggling with their mental health. There's a long period before death. Obviously, many of these situations, it's a traumatic death, and we'll talk about the effect of traumatic death a little bit later. There's also the experience of post-mortem, the conversations as to whether there will be one, why, the emotional distress of a post-mortem, and also, obviously, because of a post-mortem and a potential inquest, delays for the funeral, which can be really distressing. I think culturally, in many of our communities, a funeral should take place very quickly, particularly with our Muslim communities and Jewish communities. So any delays for them is distressing, as it is for anyone who has a loved one is not able to have a funeral as and when they would like to plan it. So huge unknowns. Also, excuse me, that delay in answers. Why did they die? Could it have been preventable? Were there things that were missed, overlooked, neglected, etc.? The inquests can be, excuse me, can be anything up to 12 or more weeks post-death. That is a long time to have those unknowns. And also, I think it builds up the expectations of what the inquest is going to do. As Oliver said, there are those 4 questions: who, where, when, and how. And it's the how that perhaps is the most anxious making, and the one where people are wanting answers. And I often, when I talk to people about an upcoming inquest, is that there might not be all the answers. Sometimes it is not black and white. Sometimes it is grey. Sometimes there is that desire to apportion blame, which is not the role of an inquest. The other thing is, our families very much divided as to what they want and what they don't want. You have to go to the inquest. You don't have to go to the inquest, or different ways of dealing with traumatic death. So within that setting, you've got the family and all their different outlooks and distresses. Next slide, please. I think bearing in mind that there will be a traumatic element to nearly all the deaths associated with inquest, I think we need to recognise that many of family, close friends and others will be in sort of what I call traumatic brain mode. It doesn't necessarily mean that this will go on to be long-term post-traumatic stress disorder, but there are many traumatic elements that do affect the way that people think, the way they react, the way they are coping post-death, but also some of the traumatic things leading to that death. And as you can see on that slide, there are different ways that we respond. The flight, fight, or freeze response is a very natural, a very helpful response, but it's being overstimulated and triggered by everyday events and also the traumatic event itself. It can affect us in so many different ways. It can also bring out very strong emotions that can become real barriers to communication with solicitors, police, hospital, family, friends. So actually, although many of you will know far more about this than I do, I think reminding ourselves that actually when people are in a state of trauma, they react differently, they behave differently, and they're very much on guard. They're very much in that sense of a place of threat. And that's always worth bearing in mind. Next slide, please. So obviously, being involved in a traumatic experience, bearing in mind that some of the families will have been present at this traumatic death or there soon after or there in the build-up, that it can affect, obviously, mental health. I think that goes without saying, but examples there. I've added anger on the bottom. Anger is a grey area which isn't defined as a mental health issue, but obviously it's a hugely strong emotion that can cause huge problems for the person, for others around them. And although it can be very much about unmet need, the expression of it can cause obviously so many difficulties. So I think it's a completely understandable emotion, but actually helping people feel safe to express it in a constructive way is so important. Next slide, please. Obviously, as mentioned, in a traumatic state, huge effect on relationships, and that is in the biggest, widest sense. Sadly, there is a high rate of relationship breakdown, whether it be in a family, between siblings, between health professionals, social care professionals, and the people involved after a traumatic experience. So, you know, those are huge things to deal with. And the next slide, please. And then physical health. Obviously, you know, if our brain is on that sense of high alert, high sort of hypersensitivity, hypervigilance, that is going to affect us physically. And all of those things will be barriers to work, to recovery and grief. They are big blockers. Next slide, please. And just to say, I'm very aware that I am rushing, but I also want to allow time for questions at the end to the panel. I think, Leela, you said it far more clearly than I will ever say it, that actually that preparation and knowledge about an inquest is so important. It is a very rarefied environment, a very formal environment, a scary environment, that actually giving people information, talking through their expectations of what an inquest is, and maybe more importantly, what it isn't, is so important. The Coroner's Support Service has really good information. A lot of it is obviously written information, but they also have a series of videos which are much more accessible and in English, if you know what I mean, very accessible for people of different cognitive abilities, but also when you're in a sense of trauma, actually it's very difficult to digest information. And a lot of the videos are done by volunteers or families of people who have been in an inquest process. So that's really, really a good link. And where you can, in your situation, help people access that information, or maybe talk to someone else who's been through an inquest process, go and see the room, all those things that Leela talked about, making sure the language is appropriate. All of those things can be really helpful, and taking that time can make that process so much less distressing and painful. Next slide, please. In terms of bereavement support, I realise that this could go on for pages, and because there are so many amazing charities and other support services for people dealing with bereavement. And I think in many of the nature of the death that many people will experience that needs to go to an inquest, actually it needs to be specialist services. So whether it be widowed and young, whether it be suicide bereavement support, whether it be for parents who've lost a child, I think it being specialist support is really, really important. At Owen Mitchell, we're really privileged that we work with a number of bereavement charities, but also a lot of charities that do pre-bereavement. So, for example, Mesothelioma UK, working with people who know that their illness is progressive and is going to lead to death, actually having the conversations about post-mortem, inquest, etc. It can be really, really helpful. So I've listed some of them there. It's not intended to be exclusive or listing people that, you know, are my favourites. It's so that you can have a resource. I think probably the two main resources on there that I would encourage you to look further into would be the Good Grief Trust, which is an umbrella service, so that they have links to many other charities and really, really accessible. And also the Coroner's Support Service has a directory of national charities, and I would hope sickle cell is on there. but also local charities. So that's really important. It also, you know, we recognise that people grieve in many different ways. And I think recognising, say, for example, for young people, going to a forming counselling session might not be appropriate, but having a forum online or a peer support can be particularly helpful. So it's being creative and looking around for the most appropriate. Obviously, if someone is displaying ongoing, very complex grief reactions or PTSD, then that would need specialist support again. So I have put the PTSD UK guidelines on their details, and obviously there are support for people doing trauma therapy. Next slide, please. So just to remind us that these are very common emotions and experiences of people who've been affected by the coronal process because of the death of a loved one. But actually, all of us, whether it be in a coroner's office, a hospice, a lung cancer team, even a solicitor, I should say, that we are affected by those in our own life, but also in the work that we do. And it's really important that we have a very different degree, different extent of these, but that actually we recognise when our buttons are being pushed and that we are struggling. So I've got a few slides on self-care, which I think is really important when we're dealing with vulnerable people, but also recognising that we are vulnerable too. We are affected by these things too, obviously at a very, very different degree and level. And that simple illustration of the oxygen mask in an aeroplane, where they always say, put on your own oxygen mask before you help others, that we need to keep our oxygen, our nourishment, our support, our exercise, good food, fresh air, whatever it is, need to keep those levels up to be doing the sort of work we're doing and to support people at a very vulnerable time. Next slide, please. Those are just a few reminders of things that we need to do to thrive and to continue to do the type of work we do. And I'll leave those for you. Next slide, please. Just end on a little bit of a silly note, but I think an important note as well. When we're talking about self-care, a friend of mine who's a Macmillan nurse, and apologies, some of you will have heard this before, she says, Michaela, there's two types of folks in life. There's drains and there's radiators. And I think she's so right that actually when we're vulnerable, there are people in our life who drain us and we're thinking, when are they going to go? I can't do any more of this. I just need for them not to be here. And there are other people who are radiators, who give us warmth, who give us energy, who inspire us to go forward and do amazing things like Leela, you've done with the Sickle Cell Association, that actually in a vulnerable time seek out the radiators and the drains. And then a last note, the hat, care of a chap living with mesothelioma in Hull. And he said he had an Aunt Mabel who always put a hat on when the front door bell rang. And we were like, why? Oh, well, then if she didn't like them and they were a drain, she'd say, oh, so sorry, I'm just about to go out. She did like them and they were a radiator, she could put her hat on and say, oh, so glad you're here, I'll put the kettle on. Thank you for your time. We have got time for some questions. I know we've had some pre-submitted. I'm also aware that we are due to finish, but obviously we will carry on. If you need to go for work or other reasons, please don't feel under any pressure to stay. But if you would like to stay for some questions to any of us, be very welcome. Are there any questions in the chat before I look at the ones that are pre-submitted? Oh, we all love that awkward silence. So some of the questions here, which I think is a really good question, is there anything more you feel clerks, so that would be coroner's clerks in the coroner's office, could do on the day or leading up to the day to best support you during the inquest process? What do you wish was done or said to or for you before the inquest? I wonder if you wouldn't mind, Leela, if that would be a good question for you.
I think actually going into that office, because all my contact was over the phone, I only went to pick up paperwork. That's all I went for. So maybe getting you in the office, having a formal or informal conversation with you where you're comfortable, to explain the process to you. Obviously we had to ask Sinead. That's not sure Sinead's forte. It's not her.
But without legal representation, what would?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we would have just literally turned up on the day, not knowing what was going on, been took into the room, sit down with you. They are very empathetic, very, very amazing people who we dealt with. But when it came to feeding us information, 0 out of 10.
So good on the day, but actually in terms of preparation, a lot more they could do to make it less scary.
It was very good at.
It was
very good at responding to emails. Every time I emailed, I'd get a quick response. But other than that, didn't really get no information.
I wonder if they've thought at some point when solicitors were involved, they may have took a step back. So maybe it could have been different.
No, because I was in touch with them before you was involved.
Okay.
It was the same all the process,
Yeah.
all the way through. The process was the same,
Okay.
even when you took over.
So maybe then it's that initial contact, having that a pack or something you mentioned earlier to say this is what the process is.
So I think with Darnell, I think Darnell's case was completely different anyway, because it was such a long drawn out process. It was like a year before we got to the coroner's, because the coroner was waiting for something specific from the hospital before they decided what they was going to do. So it was already a long drawn out process. So then obviously being in touch with the officers, it was just waiting, and it was a waiting game, and even that was long and drawn out. And they did actually say to me, we're going to go quiet now. And that's like, okay, what does that mean? Because I don't understand what's going on, and I didn't understand what was going on.
And I think that's a really good example. And I mean, a year is a long, long time to be waiting. And people say to me, well, I can't really get on with anything until I know why. And a year to wait for that is really hard. I know, I'd be interested to know if the coroner's office told you about the coroner support service. No.
Nothing.
Because they are a great service, and they, for example, provide volunteers so that if someone doesn't have family or friends nearby to take them, they'll be with them, they'll explain to them, because it's so daunting. But also, if you've got a year to build up to it, that stress building up. So, I mean, if that could be one good thing that could come from this, that anyone who's involved can encourage people to go to that service or to ask. And as you said, as a mum of a disabled child, you have to, keep fighting and be strong and say, challenge them, and not just go, oh yes, lovely, thank you very much. And actually knowing what questions, or knowing what's your right to say, I need to know where it is, I want to physically see the building, or where do I park? Practical things, or is there a loo nearby? Because I know when I'm anxious, I need the loo. Whatever it is, actually being able to ask those questions, and encouraging people, it is their right to know those things.
I will say with my husband, do you remember the guy that was in the actual court?
Yeah.
He was amazing with my husband,
Yeah,
because
he
he's
was.
got mental health anyway. And he could see, he was watching my husband, and he could see when he was dipping, and he followed him outside a few times out of the room.
It was great.
And yeah, it was amazing with him. Absolutely, yes.
Pause.
Yeah.
We'll tell the coroner, to hold, wait until he comes back, and he was fantastic.
Yeah.
On the day.
Yes. So that was on the day, which is before, obviously, it's the beforehand, not on the day, that matters.
And especially with a year's build up, I mean, what you're bringing, the emotion you're bringing to that day is huge. So
yeah, because the anger's building. So I'm like, what's going on? Hurry up. And I think you don't get a closure from coroners. There's no possible way you can get closure from it. In my case, it was a confirmation of what I already knew. So they're confirming what I'd already said had happened. They just confirmed it. and that's all I needed. But it wasn't closure. They just gave me more information to have to go and process, to know it wasn't just the hospital that, I'm going to say, it caused it. It was the whole system that caused his death.
It's not an easy
Thank
process
you.
at all.
No, thank you for your honesty, Leela. Another question. Have we got time for another one, Donna?
Yes, one more.
Okay. I think there was one question about what emotional practical support is available. I think we've covered that one, if that's all right. The other one is, can you comment on situation where a client refuses to heed advice about an inquest and they go their own way, but they still have a claim ongoing? Oliver, I'm looking at you.
I was looking at Sinead. I might ask Sinead to jump in if I don't cover it. I suppose the starting point in the solicitor-client relationship is the solicitor provides advice and the client provides instructions. The client is the boss, effectively. And an analogy I've heard people use is that the client, a bereaved family in this case, is driving the car and a solicitor is sitting next to them with a map in the passenger seat. And if I say, I think we should turn right up ahead, the client might decide, no, I think we should carry straight on or go left. And the caveat to that is that as long as one of our clients doesn't want to do something that would breach any of our professional conduct obligations to the court or to them or to other parties, or anything that would be unlawful, then we act on the instructions of our clients and we are advisors. So I'm not sure whether this question is considering that situation where the client of legal representatives might be doing something or wanting to do something that would lead to a kind of breakdown of the solicitor-client relationship. If it's in that kind of scenario, then a solicitor may need to cease acting for a client if it is like that. But if it's merely a situation, where a solicitor advises something in relation to an inquest and a client wants to do something else, then ultimately it is the client's decision. They can take or leave the legal advice they receive. So hopefully that answers that person's question. Sinead, I don't know if there's anything you'd want to chip in from your experience or knowledge on that.
The only thing other than to say that I couldn't have explained that any better, Ollie, so thank you. But I suppose there are some instances where the family come to solicitors after an inquest. I know, Leela, you mentioned that beforehand, where some law firms may say, we'll go through the inquest process first and then come to us afterwards to see if there is a potential claim for compensation, whether that be personal injury, clinical negligence. So there are those circumstances. So I wonder if whether there is that situation where there is an inquest and the family don't want representation, but the solicitor is instructed for a clinical negligence case. That obviously can happen. But it's usually what would happen is if there is an inquest and a potential clinical negligence case, in my experience, it would be better to support the family through that process. As we've all heard today, it is not an easy process to have to go through at all. And your analogy there, Oliver, is perfect. That's one I will certainly take away. Because it's you trying to be supportive of someone who is going through a very traumatic time. So I would always say, if there is that opportunity to support them alongside a clinical negligence case, personal injury, for example, then absolutely do so.
I think you're absolutely right, Sinead. And I think, so much of it, both before cause of death, after support, it's all about good relationship and good communication, isn't it? And we can now add good sat-nav as well. So a solicitor is a sat-nav. I like that. So thank you all. I think we'll bring it to a close. And before we go, I'd just like to thank all our contributors. Thank you so much for coming. Owen Mitchell has a wide-ranging series of webinars and podcasts that are available on our website. So if there are topics that appeal to you, please do take time. Far more interesting than Wimbledon or football. Please access those on our website. We also obviously have information about the support we provide for people in situations such as Leela. Also, we'd like to invite you to our bereavement conference, which is taking place in Manchester on the 5th of December. We will put you on the mailing list so that if you would be interested in coming to that, you're very welcome. Also, this is a series of webinars about the coronial process. And so watch this space for information about the next one, which we will send to you also with the slides. So thank you very much for your time. Look after yourselves and enjoy the summer of sport, even if we haven't got the weather to go with it.